Thank you. I find myself in Bhubaneswar now almost every year, and it keeps getting bigger and busier, and I presume it's all a sign of prosperity. So may you continue to prosper. When did I write my first book? It was, well, actually I wrote my first book when I was in school, and I was about 12 years old in class 7 or 8. No, don't clap, because it got me into trouble. I used to write funny things about my class teachers and housemaster and other people in a notebook. And this sort of gathered momentum until it covered 2 or 3 exercise books. So you could call it, in fact, a memoir of sorts. But it fell into the hands of my class master, who then summoned me to his office. And in those days, we used to get caned. And corporal punishment was the end thing. But anyway, it led to my discovery of literature, because my friend said, Bond, when you go there for your punishment, stuff a couple of books down your trousers at the back, so you won't feel it when you get flogged. So I did as I was told, and I went to the headmaster's office, and he said, bend over, Bond, which I did. Whack. It didn't hurt too much. And he said, I know you've got something there, Ruskin, out with it. So reluctantly I pulled out As You Like It by William Shakespeare. My introduction to Shakespeare. He gave me another one, and that too wasn't too effective. So he said, there's something else over there. So out I pulled Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And he said, you're going to remember this hiding anyway. And so he tore up my first novel or memoir, but that didn't discourage me. As you know, I went on to write others.
Thank you, Ruskin. We have on stage with us young Anantinee, who's got a first book published age 10. So you are an amazing child, because at the age of 10, the last thing you should be wanting to do is to write a book. You should be going around playing, and instead of which you've actually sat down, written stories, got them published. How did this come about? Were you always interested? Did you always want to be a writer, or how did it come? What was the process?
Yes, I always wanted to become a writer, because writing is sort of my first love. So I started writing at the age of 8, small stories, short stories, articles. I started sending them to different magazines to get them published. But I never thought of writing a book until last year, when last year's Bhubaneswar literary meet, I met with Sir, and he was one of my first inspiration to write a book, because I saw that writing short stories and articles is fine, but when I saw Sir, I realized that my goal should be writing a book. So I started combining my short stories, writing new ones. So I think it just came up because for me writing is a passion.
And did it affect your studies? Were you, instead of playing outside, you would come and write? Because it's difficult as it is to be a school child with all this pressure that you have. How did you wake up 1 hour earlier? And
no, actually I believe that if you really want to do something from your heart, you have a true passion and determination towards it, you don't have to manage anything. It fits to its own accord. I don't think I ever got pressurized from studies, because my parents always encouraged me, helped me, and made me relax, calm down when I was a bit pressurized. So as I said, if you really want to do something, you don't have to do it.
Well, I better take your advice. So what are your next plans? Are you going to write a novel now, or what do you want to do?
Yes, my second book will be a novel, because I like to experiment things I like to try out different things. So I think I'm gonna try for a novel. I've already started it, and I'm gonna, I think, focus on writing novels only this year.
Before we let you go, Ruskin, do you have some advice for her? She's going to be your biggest rival, I can tell you.
That's true. It's good to know that I'm setting off and encouraging others to write. And I wouldn't say they become rivals, but in a way competitors, because the last time I dropped in at one of my publishers' offices in Delhi, and Mr. Mayor of Rupa said, now Mr. Bond, we've got all these young writers here, 20, 30 of them. I don't need you anymore. So if you like, you can go on and write film scripts. Huh?
Yeah.
So there you are. But passion is the thing. I think that's the word our young writer used. And passion is what keeps you going, which helps you to work harder, to meet with disappointments, which as a writer you will meet, no matter how good you are. And so I think the commitment to writing well, to literature, that's the all-important thing, passion.
So before I let you go, is there any particular piece of advice you want from Ruskin? This is a golden opportunity. You've got him.
I'd like to know that Sir always, in his writings, he has something magical, like he can connect to the person who's reading it. I'd like to learn that, is there some secret ability you have got that you can, just write so beautifully and enhance it so well, so gracefully. I think that's one of the most important piece of advice I want to know from Sir.
No, thank you so much for your kind words. But there's no secret really. You just have to be yourself and write as you would be writing to a close friend or even to yourself. Very often, I think the best writers or the greatest are those who are writing for themselves to get joy and satisfaction out of the very process of putting words together and making beautiful sentences. So just be yourself and you will be a fine writer.
Yeah. Thank you, Anantinee. Come, sit there.
Do you have your book with you? Yeah?
Well, bring it back when you after this, when the session is over.
She gave me a copy last night, which I've hidden away.
Come, sit. So, Ruskin, this session is called Bonding with Books. I mean, your life is books. You write them, you read them, you review them. Can you imagine a life without books? I mean,
no, because I sleep on top of them too.
There you are.
I've got so many books at home that I've spread them out, especially the ones that I'm not too fond of, but they accumulate, so I spread them out, put a mattress on.
There you are. So, I mean, another way of keeping check is to see if the royalty check comes or not.
Yes, I'm not a bad manager. My business senses are tolerably efficient. So it's nice to be in this wonderful campus, which I believe is where you can get your MBA. Somebody came up to me in a bookshop the other day and said, "Mr. Bond, when did you do your MBA?" To tell him that there was no such thing 30, 40, 50 years back. But there you are, so many people now doing MBA. Wonderful.
A lot of people ask, particularly about you, because you're so prolific, do you have a discipline? Like, and would you say that I wake up at 6 and I will write X number of words till 10 or something like that? Or just let it flow?
Well, Bikram, discipline is important, but I don't overdo it. I'm basically a pretty lazy person, actually. But if at the end of the day I haven't written anything, my conscience will prick me. So I will try in the course of the day to at least do an hour or two's writing. And an hour or two is enough, because after that you probably flag a bit. So I'll try to do a little every day, even if it's just a page or two. And then I'll read a lot. I'm still a great reader. And I'll sleep a lot too, go for walks. And I even record my dreams because that helps me in my writing. So all these little things help.
So, I mean, how do you construct a book? Do you do one book at a time? Are you thinking about 4 different books? Are you writing 4 different books simultaneously? Or is it one thought, one idea, one book?
It's easier if you're doing one at a time. Otherwise, it can get a bit irritating, I think, if you have to go from one to the other. But sometimes you might just get writer's block and get stuck in the middle of a story or a book or something that you've been working on. So, and then it helps if you can move on to something else. Write a different story, work on a different kind of book, and then come back to the original one later. So that in a way gives you breathing space and a little rest, because I certainly don't believe in overwork, nor do I believe in underwork. So I think, but steady work, which I've been doing now for 65 years or more. When did I start? My first story was published 1951, which is a long, long time ago, I realize.
So, you're India's best loved author, without doubt. You should see the crowds wherever you go, your books, people wait for your books to come out. Do you set a standard for yourself? Say that, look, this didn't quite meet it, I'm going to start all over again. Or have you now reached a stage where you can tell that this is a good book, that it's satisfying you more than
yes,
the reader?
I think it does have to satisfy me. It has to satisfy the author, I think, first of all. And if I write a piece, or maybe a story, or even an opening chapter of a novella, and I'm not happy with it, and I might just stir it up, or I might or put it aside and maybe come back to it later. So yes, I think it is important to be a hard taskmaster with oneself, because that will at least keep your writing at a certain level. So you don't want it to fall off, as it can well do if you've been writing for a large number of years. You're inclined to get bogged down in the same themes, or in similar characters. So you have to sort of stay fresh. And the best way of staying fresh is to open your window and look out at the world, or let the world come in. That's all important.
Ruskin,
Bikram here is a great bird watcher and ornithologist, so he knows all about the pleasures of open spaces.
Yes. Ruskin, a lot of people, younger generation who don't know about your history think that you're an Englishman, which you are, but you live in England, but you live in the mountains, you live in Missouri, in Landor, how come? Just tell them a little bit about your childhood so that people who don't know your background.
Yes, well, I grew up, not many people know, in a small port town called Jamnagar in Kathiawar, which was one of the states. Kathiawar was a conglomeration of royal states, and my father was working for the Jam Sabha, the Raja of that state. Jamnagar was incidentally the home of Indian cricket. That's where Ranjit Singh Ji was the ruler. He played for England and he played for India. Then his nephew, Dalip Singh Ji, was another great cricketer. And the Ranji Trophy, the Dalip Trophy are named after them.
Now Ajay Jadeja.
The Jadejas are there. And Vinu Mankad got his training there. So as a very small boy, I used to watch these cricket matches out on the... They didn't actually turn me into a cricketer, but I used to like going along to them because every now and then a tray of gulab jamuns would come along, and then rasgullas and jalebis, and for a 5-year-old boy, I thought cricket was a great game, especially with all these eatables coming around. But then World War II broke out, and my father went into the RAF, and he died when I was just 10. But he'd been a great companion, and he imbued in me a love of books, of even music and films. So I had this very important grounding, this you might say, literature, which stood me in great stead in the coming years, because I went through a rather difficult and unhappy period, adjusting to a new home, a stepfather and all that. But the love of books and the love of writing was what really kept me going. And in the due course, it became my vocation, it became my profession and livelihood, and it made life so wonderful for me.
For those of you who want to know more about Ruskin and his younger days, you should read his new book, Lone Fox Dancing, which is absolutely magical. And so, first thing you should do is to just go and buy a copy, and you will know all about it.
Thank you. I must, before we go on to Lone Fox, I must tell you that many years ago, Bikram invited me for a dinner consisting of roast duck. It remained always a mystery where he got the duck from.
Shan't tell you that.
But there was certainly a shortage of ducks on the hillside after he left.
So, one of your genres, which is beloved by lots of people, is the ghost stories that you write. I mean, tell us a little bit more about how you got involved in ghosts and...
Ghosts, well, you see, when I usually write about people. It's people who make stories. And if I run out of people, I write about birds and animals and wildlife. And if I run out of those themes and then I'm really hard up, I can always invent or cook up a ghost. So it's not that I believe in ghosts, although I keep seeing them now and then. Actually, we're surrounded by ghosts all the time. They're pressing upon us. All our ancestors and great ancestors, they're hovering around, probably trying to help us in the best way they can, but we don't really see them, unfortunately. So there are ghosts and all kinds of ghosts, and I've written a few ghost stories, and in fact some of them are now being turned into... I'm technologically illiterate, but my ghosts have become digital now, and they're being made into digital films. So you'll be able to see some of the ghost stories on your WhatsApp or your laptop, things that I don't keep myself.
One of your books was converted into a film by Shashi Kapoor, Flight of Pigeons, I think it was. And what was your first experience with Hindi filmdom?
Yes, that was my first experience with the film world, when Flight of Pigeons was taken up and was produced by Shashi Kapoor, who took the lead role, and it was directed by Shyam Benegal, who was an eminent director, and it was a very interesting, unusual film, set in the time of the 1857 uprising. And I thought the performances were very good, and it was called Junoon, of course, as you know. And then a few years back, Vishal Bhardwaj took one of my stories, The Blue Umbrella, a children's story, and made it into a lyrical, a beautiful film. Then we worked on Susanna's Seven Husbands, which had a ghost in it, but the ghost was eliminated when the film was made. But that became Saat Khoon Maaf. And so I've had this sort of tenuous connection with the films and the film world, although I don't write screenplays or scripts. I just write a story or a novel, and if somebody comes along and thinks it'll make a good movie, that's fine by me. I usually part with the film rights. But I haven't written specifically for films, for the screen.
One of your major characters is Rusty, which you've written a fair bit about. How did Rusty come up? Is there something of you in Rusty?
Yeah, Rusty is a sort of alter ego. When I wrote The Room on the Roof, my first novel, of course at that age, you see, when you're 16 or 17, you can only write out of your own experience, or write about yourself, your own boyhood, because you've yet to collect experiences. And that's the problem for very young writers too. The first book comes easily. Sometimes the second book is very hard, because you're still growing up and you've yet to accumulate a little bit of experience, a little bit of wisdom. So, but that first book was about myself, and I just called myself Rusty in it, and the character appears later on in other stories. So sort of Rusty became a sort of a name that became familiar with young readers.
So are you going to, your next few books, have you ever contemplated writing a sort of adult novel in the Bikram school or anything of that nature? Because you have a wealth of experience too.
Well, I've written adult stories and adult novellas. I certainly won't be sitting down to write a
600-page epic.
600-page epic, or because whatever I want to do now, I would like to do it in this lifetime and not in the next. So whatever I write now will be on the short side. But I have written for adults. In fact, one of my stories back in the 1970s got me into trouble. It was called The Sensualist, and there was an obscenity charge in Bombay, and for 2 years I kept having to go to court, and this case dragged on, and finally, of course, I got an honorable discharge, and the judge said he'd enjoyed the story, which was which was great, except that I had 2 years running up and down to Bombay into the courts. So my advice to anybody is, don't do anything that will get you into litigation, because in our dear country, litigation can last a lifetime, as some of you probably know.
You know, Ruskin, all your sessions that I've attended, there are so many questions that people ask. So I'm going to go straight into the questions from the audience, and then we'll keep chatting. Is Sukanya here? Can she come and help me with handling this? We will take questions from you one at a time. Please raise your hands, and then somebody will come from the audio, from this thing, and hand you a mic. Is Sukanya here?
Yes, Sukanya is here.
Sukanya, you know, handling this is very difficult, Ruskin sessions.
Yes.
So
I'm here.
will you come and handle it with me one at a time, please? Sukanya will come and give you a. Well, let's do 10 minutes or something like that, and then we'll see how it goes.
Book, I'm sure, and it's wonderful if it's at 6 years old you're already reading stories and books. That's a good sign. That means you'll always be a good reader and a good writer if you want to write too, because to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader.
So I am Chakyusha from Devi Pokhariput. So I am a voracious reader of your stories. So I also have an aim to become an author. So I want some tips on becoming an author.
Well,
Yes, well, the first tip is be a good reader, because that's where you'll learn to use language well. Language is all important. It's not just a question of dashing off a story, you see. You have to use words, you have to create sentences, you have to make it all very interesting. And so you must have a good command of language. So don't neglect or your composition and your grammar in school, because that's the basis of good writing. So that's one tip. And later on, when you become a writer, well, work hard.
best of luck to you.
Next
Yeah.
question, young lady here.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm a great fan of yours. I want to ask, why did you name the book A Flight of Pigeons, the name?
Well, in the book, the pigeons, I think, had a certain symbolism in that they flew away when the gun started going off, and later they circled, and towards the end of the story, they settled down again. In a way, being symbolic of the return of peace and harmony. So I use the pigeons as symbols there, as writers very often do in with animals or birds.
Next question goes to the young gentleman in the striped t-shirt.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Arpit. I'm from DAV School. Sir, where were you inspired from writing these books?
What was your inspiration?
Well, different books have perhaps different origins, and A Flight of Pigeons, which you just mentioned, goes back to the 1857 uprising, and it took place in a small town called Shahjahanpur, which is incidentally was where my father was born. My 4 generations. They're very much a part of the Indian dust. So I'd heard this story about the girl whose father was killed in the church, and how she was then kidnapped locally, and her adventures. So it's a true story, and I wanted it to be known, to be better known, because it brought out the better aspects of humanity in a time of conflict. So that was one story. Room on the Roof was my own story. Then a novella called Maharani was the story of a rather eccentric person. So again, people. It's people who, in a way, inspire you, but they give you the ideas, or their lives are good enough to become stories that I can tell.
We'll take another 4 or 5 questions.
We'll take 4 or 5 questions, but we must not forget that Mr. Bond also writes for adults. So do we have anyone above the age of 18? Yes?
Or 6.
Okay. Or 6, yes.
Let them.
Yes. Film, the beginning, the middle, the end, the characters, the dialogue, the whole point and meaning of it. So if you've written it in your head, then you're not going. It's only a question of putting it down in words and in language and making it interesting. So half the work is done before. Whereas if you start straight off and dash straight off into your story, and you might well get bogged down halfway through because the plot might not work out, or you suddenly it starts you lose direction. So it's best to plan or plot your story, your poem, your essay, whatever you're writing, in advance. In fact, visualize it, see it in your head. I hope that helps.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, the most striking feature of your stories to me is that you have stayed relevant for a long, long time, for kids, for adults, from the 1950s to the 2000s. You have stayed so relevant. So how do you do that? Do you, consciously try to stay relevant for the audience that you're writing for?
Not consciously, no. But I'll tell you something. If a book or a story often gets dated because it's about current events, which lose their relevance very quickly. So you say there's some turmoil in your city over maybe a strike or something happening in a college, and you write a story about it. It might be a very good story. But 10, 15 years later, somebody will pick it up and say, what's this all about? Huh? It's too remote. So my stories are basically about people falling in love, or falling out of love, or wanting to do something different, having adventures, living with birds and animals, or just seeing ghosts. So these things are always relevant. They don't go out of date. So it's not something that I've done deliberately, but it just happens to be the way I write.
One last question. With that, we will move on to book signing. No, just one last question from the gentleman there.
Hello, sir. This is Sujit Raut. I want to ask you a question. There are many characters in your novel, and how do you manage to switch between the characters, because they have varied emotions? As for example, there is a movie called Blue Umbrella.
Yes.
The little kid, the little girl is there. Then how do you manage in this age, how to understand that particular psychology of that girl, and how do that story move on? and how do you plan?
Well, again, I guess it boils down to it being a gift. You know, writing is a gift, and sometimes people ask me, are writers born or are they made? And I think a certain kind of writer is born, or rather it's within his or her nature to be a writer and to be able to look into people's hearts and minds and understand them. And there's another kind of writer who can be made and is a more objective sort of writer and who can write about anything under the sun if you learn how to do it. So there are all kinds of writers, and perhaps I'm the one who just found that it was a gift to be able to write about people and their feelings and the way they interact with each other.
Like all good things, even this must come to an end. Ruskin will be available there. May I request you not to crowd him and stay outside the blue thing, and you'll be called in one by one to sign his papers. Can you just organize that part of it? And
We will, Mr. Bond will only be signing his own books. So if you are carrying an autograph book or a slam book, it's best to get a copy of one of his books, which is available right there at the bookstore. And we would request you to please do this in an organized and disciplined manner so that Sir can give us his time and not feel
But if you
crowded.
bring me one of Bikram's books, I'll sign that too.
well, no, that's all right. This is your. Thank you, Ruskin. Always a pleasure.